Picture this. It's the middle of the 1300s, and a silent, invisible killer is sweeping across the entire known world. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, young or old. Entire towns just fall silent. Fear becomes the new king. This was the Black Death, truly one of the most devastating pandemics in all of human history. And the crazy part? It all started with something impossibly small.
I mean, it sounds like a riddle, right? How could something so tiny bring actual empires to their knees and totally reshape the course of civilization? But that is exactly what happened. This little insect was the delivery system for a catastrophe that would redefine an entire era.
All right, so where does this whole story even begin? Well, it doesn't start with a big explosion, but with a quiet, creeping menace. Let's trace its journey all the way from the heart of Asia to the shores of Europe.
So, the plague's journey was long, and it was methodical. It got its start way back in the 1330s in Asia. And you know how it traveled? It hitched a ride on one of the most famous trade networks in history, the Silk Road. For more than 10 years, it was a hidden passenger, traveling with merchants and their goods, slowly making its way west, until, in 1347, it finally knocked on Europe's door.
Okay, to really get the horror of this, we gotta look at the science. The real culprit was a microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Now, this bacterium lived in the blood of fleas, and those fleas lived on black rats. And guess what rats love to do? They were the ultimate stowaways on trading ships. So when those ships docked in busy Italian ports like Messina and Genoa, they weren't just unloading silks and spices. They were unleashing a biological time bomb.
And once it made landfall, forget about it. There was no stopping it. The disease just exploded out from those coastal cities, moving inland with terrifying speed. It tore through France, Spain, England, and then the rest of the continent, leaving nothing but death and devastation behind.
But here's where it gets even more terrifying. This wasn't just one single disease. Oh no, it was a monster with 3 distinct faces, and each one was somehow more horrifying than the last.
First up, you had the most famous one, the bubonic plague. It was named for these agonizingly painful swellings, called buboes, that would pop up. Then you had the pneumonic form, which was even scarier because it attacked the lungs. That meant it could spread directly from person to person with just a cough. And finally, the septicemic plague. This one infected the bloodstream itself, turning the skin dark, which is how the Black Death got its chilling name. And this is the number that shows you the sheer terror of it all. From the very first symptom to death was usually a matter of just 2 to 5 days. Think about that. In a world with no concept of germs, no antibiotics, no treatments at all, getting sick basically meant you'd been handed a death sentence. There was just no hope. So, when you're faced with an invisible killer, you can't stop, and you can't understand. What happens? Well, the very fabric of society just begins to unravel. Let's look at how the world descended into absolute chaos. You have to remember, without any science to explain it, people were desperate for answers. They grasped for anything they could. Was this a punishment from God? Was it something in the stars, the alignment of the planets? Or was it darker? Was it witchcraft? Fear and superstition just took over, and that often had deadly consequences for innocent people who got the blame.
It's hard to imagine, but the most basic human connections just shattered. Parents would abandon their own sick kids. Husbands and wives fled from each other. That deep instinct for self-preservation just overrode everything else. Entire cities became ghost towns, as anyone who could just ran for the hills, often, and tragically, taking the disease right along with them.
And this chaos gave us one of the most haunting images in all of history, the plague doctor. See, they thought the disease was spread by miasma, or just bad air. So to protect themselves, they wore these terrifying, bird-like masks with long beaks, and they'd stuff the beaks with herbs and flowers, hoping it would filter out the poison. It was a desperate solution based on a total misunderstanding of the enemy.
This crisis also caused a massive spiritual split. On one hand, you had tons of people flocking to the church, praying like never before for deliverance. But on the other hand, as the bodies piled up and all those prayers seemed to go unanswered, countless others just lost their faith entirely. They felt completely abandoned by God.
But eventually, the storm did pass. Around 1351, the worst of the plague began to subside. And from the ashes of this unbelievable catastrophe, something completely new began to grow. A whole new world was about to be born.
You can really see the massive shift when you put it side by side like this.
Before the plague, you had plenty of workers, so labor was cheap. Afterwards, with maybe half the population gone, workers were suddenly scarce, and they had power. The church's authority, once absolute, was now shaken. And art. Art went from these perfect religious scenes to grim, dark reflections on death and just how fragile life really is.
Yeah, that labor shortage was a total game changer. For the first time ever, the surviving peasants actually had leverage. They started demanding better pay, better working conditions, more freedom. This new power led to huge peasant revolts all across Europe as the old guard tried to hang on, and it ultimately dealt a fatal blow to the whole feudal system that had defined society for centuries.
And this brings us to a really strange paradox. This absolutely horrifying event, which basically ended the medieval world, also cleared the path for what came next. By shattering all the old social and religious rules and forcing people to question everything, the Black Death accidentally helped set the stage for the Renaissance.
So, what's the big takeaway here? What's the ultimate legacy of this world-changing pandemic? What can we learn from this incredibly dark chapter in our history? First, we just have to sit with this number for a second. 50 million. That's the estimated death toll in Europe alone. It might have been hundreds of millions worldwide. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to wrap your head around, a brutal reminder of the immense human cost.
But humanity survived, and in the centuries that followed, the painful lessons from the plague actually pushed us forward. It was a brutal wake-up call that eventually led to a much deeper understanding of public health, of hygiene, and the science of how diseases actually spread.
The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was a fundamental turning point. It proved how one single crisis can completely reshape our world, for better and for worse. It shows us how vulnerable we are, but also how resilient we can be. And that leaves us with one final thought. What can this profound moment of crisis from 700 years ago still teach us about the challenges we're facing right now?